turn it over to Mark.
All right. Now, I just want to start off by reading 2 Timothy 2:15, which is the main topic that I want to talk about. Be diligent to present yourselves approved of God, a worker who does not need to be ashamed, rightly dividing the word of truth. Now, why does the word need to be divided? Trying to make this interactive, but I'll just say that the reason it needs to be divided, because there's two covenants, and they're not exactly the same, although they're very similar. Now in Hebrews 8 and in Galatians 4, Paul talked about two covenants. What was the first covenant that Paul was talking about? Anybody? Please bring it on.
You can unmute and speak.
Yes, Mark, may I speak freely?
Go ahead.
I'll take the shot in the dark and say the old and the new.
Yeah, well, what was the old? What exactly was it?
Well, if we look at the new covenant and we see that it is that the law will be written in the hearts, then we can say in the old covenant it was not written in their hearts. And I would say that would probably be one of the simplest explanations of the difference between the two. Although there be many other, I'm sure, peripheral and other tangent differences that could be discussed as well.
Right. Well, you got it. That's at the core of it, because that's in Jeremiah 31. Now, there are other ramifications to it. But, I mean, I've never seen any church literature about this. And I've never heard anyone else talk about this subject. But it's a foundational subject, and you want to build a house on a foundation. Otherwise, it's not going to hold up. But that's what Jeremiah 31 says, and that's what Paul quotes from in Hebrews 8. The old covenant was written on stone. The new covenant is written on your heart. Now, that's the main difference between the two, but what exactly was the first covenant? Exactly.
Well, to approach it from the vernacular, it's going through the motions versus actually having the emotions. Yeshua even said, it's not enough to say you hate your brother or whatever it might be, or being angry at him if you even think about it. If you even bring the whole concept of the emotion about how you feel about the person, that's what really and truly gives birth to sin.
Well, I'm getting to that. But what the first covenant was, I'm looking at Exodus 34, verse 28.
Okay. Let me pull
So he was there. It says, so he was there with the Lord 40 days and 40 nights, talking about Moses on Mount Sinai. And he wrote on the tablets the words of the covenant, the 10 Commandments. The first covenant was the 10 Commandments, specifically. Now, why was the Ark of the Covenant called the Ark of the Covenant? Because it contained the words of the covenant. Now, just remember that now supposedly there's 613 laws, statutes, and ordinances in the Bible, depending on how you want to count them. I don't count them the same way that this rabbi did. I have the list right here, which I'm going to talk about later. But Moses did not he did not bring down 613 laws from Mount Sinai. He brought down the 10 Commandments, and that is all that they agreed to. Now, before that, about 400 years before that, you had the circumcision covenant. Then just before the Israelites left Egypt, they were given the Passover commandment. Then right after they left Egypt, they were given the 10 Commandments. And then they said, well, all of you that you have said we will do, and they agreed to that. That's all they agreed to. The other laws came later, and those were kind of a magnification, you could say. Now, in our country, we have a constitution upon which there are a general set of principles upon which all of our other laws are supposed to be based upon. And the Ten Commandments, in a certain sense, you could say, was the Constitution of Israel, and all the other laws were supposed to be consistent with it. But the first covenant, technically you could say there's 7 covenants in the Old Testament. That's what Mark Kaplan said. But I understood the word covenant to mean an agreement between 2 parties. This is the only covenant where there's an agreement between 2 parties. They agreed to do this. So this was the first covenant. This is what Paul was talking about in Galatians 4 and in Hebrews 8. And this is what Jeremiah was talking about. And it wasn't talking about 600 plus laws. Specifically talking about the 10 Commandments. That's it. Of course, well, you could say, well, you got a circumcision and Passover included, so you could put it up to 12. But that's all they were agreeing to. Now, I want to go to Matthew 5:17. And this is something that really has been, I think, very, very misunderstood and misinterpreted. So let's turn there. And now, for 34 years, I've been hearing the same interpretation of this over and over and over, and I heard it again at the feast this year in Michigan. And I'm not putting this guy down. He was doing a seminar, and he talked about this, and I didn't agree with him. But I'm just going to start off by reading it. Do not think that I came to destroy the law or the prophets. I did not come to destroy, but to fulfill. For assuredly I say to you, till heaven and earth pass away, not one jot or tittle will by no means pass away from the law until all be fulfilled. Now, for 34 years, I've been hearing people say that Jesus did not fulfill the law, and nothing has changed legally, and we are obligated to every jot and tittle of the law. Well, that's not quite what I am seeing, because he specifically said, I came to fulfill, and he's not talking, well, he's talking about the law. He came to fulfill the law. Now, to fulfill and destroy are 2 different things. Now, I said to this presenter at the feast, he said, well, I thought Jesus fulfilled the law. And he said, no. He said, if Jesus fulfilled the law, that means that there's no more law and we can do whatever we want. But I think people are getting distracted by what the Protestants believe, because that's how they look at it. But don't worry about the Protestants. Look at what it says. He said, I came to fulfill. What was he talking about? He's talking about the law. It doesn't mean there's no more law. He did not destroy it. He fulfilled it. And that was necessary for him to atone for our sins. If he didn't fulfill the law, he could not have atoned for our sins. We couldn't be saved. So maybe we should try to give him credit for what he did. He went through a lot of trouble to do this. Now, another thing that this guy said, and I'm not cutting the guy down, he's a good guy, but he said that this word for fulfill does not mean fulfill. He said it means magnify. Well, not according to my concordance. No, this word is correctly translated as fulfill. It does not mean magnify. He fulfilled the law. That's what it says. Now let's look at Romans 8, starting in verse 3.
Hey, Mark, this
Yeah.
is Al. I'd like to make a comment. When you said we're talking about the word fulfill, the
Yeah.
law, he went even beyond that. He was baptized, and when John the Baptist said, "What you ought to baptize me," he said, "No, but to fulfill all righteousness." He was baptized. So Jesus was baptized in order to fulfill all righteousness, even though baptism itself isn't in the law. So he really went beyond just the law proper and went to the next degree and stated that his baptism was to fulfill righteousness. Anyway, it's a small point. You can pass. You can go ahead.
Well, I wanted to say something else about baptism later, but I want to get the Romans 8:3. For what the law could not do, in that it was weak through the flesh, God did by sending his own Son in the likeness of sinful flesh on account of sin. He condemned sin in the flesh, that the righteous requirement of the law might be fulfilled in us who do not walk according to the flesh, but according to the Spirit. So here's another, this is the same word, almost exactly the same Greek word. He fulfilled the law. No, doesn't mean he destroyed it. So, all right, he fulfilled it.
Well, from a logic perspective, it doesn't make sense to say, think not I've come to destroy the law, but to destroy the law. I mean,
Well, but people think that if he fulfilled it, he destroyed it. That's not what it's saying. But I mean, don't worry about the Protestants. Look at what it says. That's what I'm saying here. Now, but here's the thing: is that I mean, when people keep saying, "Well, we got to keep every jot and tittle," well, really, is there anybody that does that? Look at Galatians 4:21. Paul wrote, "You who desire to be under the law, do you hear the law? Do you know what's actually in there?" There's more to it than you might think, and I'm going to do an overview of the law later on. We'll see how many of these you keep. Then in Galatians 5:3, it says, well, he was saying that if you think you have to be circumcised to be saved, then you're a debtor to keep the whole law. Now we can discern from that we're not a debtor to keep the whole law. But people keep thinking, people look at what Paul wrote about the law, and they think that he was trying to say that there's no law. And I've been accused of that many times too. I've never said that. But now I want to look at Acts 18:13. This fellow persuades men to worship God contrary to the law. And it caused quite a ruckus. And there was some violence involved. Now I want to go forward to Acts 21, starting in verse 21. Where some rabbis, I guess they were rabbis, they said, "But they have been informed about you, that you teach all the Jews who are among the Gentiles to forsake Moses, saying that they ought not to circumcise their children, nor walk according to the customs. What then? The assembly must certainly meet, for they will hear that you have come. Therefore, do what we tell you. We have 4 men who have taken a vow. Take them and be purified with them, and pay their expenses, that they may shave their heads." It's talking about the vow of the Nazarite. There's 4 men that were taking the vow of the Nazarite. They wanted Paul to do it with them, and he did. He didn't have to, but he did, because he was trying to show these people he was not forsaking the law, but he was saying something different, a little bit different. But this is where it gets a little more complicated. Oh, wait, I'll pick it up. We have been informed concerning you. Well, all right, now you shave your heads, and that they all may know those things of which we were informed concerning you are nothing, but that you yourself walk orderly according to the law. But concerning the Gentiles who believe, we have written and decided that they should observe no such thing, except that they should keep themselves from things offered to idols, from things, from blood, from things strangled, and from sexual immorality. Now it goes beyond that. But a lot of people have looked at what Paul has written, And you got people that are trying to interpret this into what they want it to believe, what they want to believe. You got people that don't want to keep the law. They're going to say, whoopee, there's no more law, like the Protestants. Then you got and then you got the Jews on the other hand, and one of the reasons why they reject the New Testament is because they think Paul is trying to say that there's no law, but they're overlooking Romans 3:31, among other things, where Paul said, "Do we then make void the law through faith? On the contrary, we establish the law." Now, I mean, there was, what I think we all understand that what Paul is trying to say is that we're not saved by the works of the law. That in and of itself is not sufficient. We're saved by grace through faith in Christ because we've all fallen short. We need to combine obedience to the law with faith in Christ because we've all fallen short. We need a mediator. That's what he's saying, and I think we all get that. But he was saying something a little bit different. Now, as far as when people are going to say, we're obligated to every jot and tittle, well, first of all, if you really look at the law, you don't even try to keep half of these. And then there's numerous verses in the New Testament which clearly show that we are not obligated to every jot and tittle. And there's more than 5 books in the Bible. There's 93 of them. The New Testament was written for a reason. And we should appreciate that. But people keep overlooking some of these things, especially the book of Hebrews in particular, which was addressed to Jews, the Jerusalem congregation. And Paul was the apostle to the Gentiles. Well, why was he writing a book to the Jews in Jerusalem? Well, first of all, James had been their pastor, but he was martyred by other Jews in 62 AD. And so he was writing this to them afterwards. Now, Paul, I think, was killed, apparently, according to Ernest Martin. He said Paul was martyred in October of 66. So that would put the book of Hebrews between 62 and 66. Now, I know the scholars don't believe that Paul wrote that book. I firmly believe that Paul did write that book. And then supposedly the book was written after the temple was destroyed in 70 AD. I don't believe that. I think it was written before the temple was destroyed. There's no mention in that entire book of the temple being destroyed. But he's telling these people things that they had never heard before, things that were new to them. And he gets on their case in chapter 5, verse 11, saying, you've grown dull of hearing. And you're not ready for spiritual meat. I have to give you spiritual milk. Well, who else but Paul could have written such a thing? That's got Paul written all over it. And it was Paul that explained the new covenant. And the other apostles learned from him, and they followed in his wake. And it's definitely got to be Paul. And it was written before the temple was destroyed. Now, people will say, I want to focus right now on 3 aspects of the law that have been changed because of the new covenant, because of Christ's sacrifice. And you have to look at the meaning and the purpose of these laws before you can rightly divide the word of truth. Now, the first aspect that I want to look at is the holy days. Now, we keep those days, but we don't keep them exactly according to the letter of the law, in spite of what maybe some people might think. Now, I'm going to start off with Passover. Passover is actually in a category by itself. It's not one of the 7 annual holy days. It was actually the first real commandment after circumcision. But what it says, you've got to kill and eat a lamb or a goat the night of the Passover, and then when you don't finish, you're supposed to burn the following morning. We don't do that. Do you know why? Anybody? Yeah. Christ is our Passover lamb. The Passover lamb was symbolic of Christ. It was a precursor of Christ. It was a foreshadowing of things to come. He fulfilled it. That's why we don't do it. Now, if you want to do that, that's fine. But we don't have to do that. Not only that, according to Exodus 12:44, you have to be circumcised to keep the Passover. Now, I don't want to go over Acts 15 unless you want to, but we know what it says in there. The apostles concluded that circumcision was no longer required. Now, I'm going to talk more about that later, but that's no longer required to keep the Passover. So there's another difference. We don't kill and eat a lamb where we go. You don't have to be circumcised. Now, some people think that Christ changed the date of the Passover. It doesn't specifically say that. That's another topic which I'm not going to get into because it's very controversial. But I will suffice it to say, there's two significant differences right there. You don't have to be circumcised. You don't have to kill and eat a lamb or a goat. Not only that, we're doing something else different because Christ instituted two new symbols that are not in the Old Testament. The bread and wine ceremony and the foot washing ceremony are not in Leviticus 23. They're nowhere to be found in the Old Testament. Those are new symbols that Christ instituted that we do. So we're doing something different. We're not doing this according to the letter of the law. Now, I want to talk about the Feast of Tabernacle, Sukkot. Now, I want to relate to you a little story. Back in September 1992, I was installing some carpet for a rabbi. This is about a week or two before Tabernacles. And I said to him, well, I keep Sabbaths and holy days. And I said, I'm going to be going to Feast of Tabernacles next week. And he said, well, really, how do you keep it? And I said, well, it says we're supposed to stay in temporary dwellings, and we interpret that to mean motel rooms. And he goes, no. It says in Leviticus 23, you build a booth out of leaves and branches, and you stay in it for 8 days. And this guy literally did that in his backyard. And I didn't know what to say. I felt pretty stupid. And I'm not saying we got to do that. Because there's the spirit of the law, and then there's the letter of the law. And that's one of the main differences between the two covenants. Now, if you look at Romans 7, verse 6, what it says is, but now we have been delivered from the law, having died to what we were held by, so that we should serve in the newness of the spirit, not in the oldness of the letter. Now, in Worldwide, many times, I kept hearing, we're under both the letter and the spirit. No, that's not what it's saying here. We're not under the letter. If we were under the letter, we couldn't be saved. We're under the newness of the spirit. Now, what we're doing is in the spirit of the law. When we keep the holy days, when we keep the Feast of Trumpets and Tabernacles and so on. Now, I want to look at Colossians 2:16 and 17, an often misinterpreted verse. Therefore, let no one judge you in food or drink or regarding a festival or a new moon or Sabbaths, which are a shadow of things to come, but the substance is of Christ. Now, this is talking about, this was addressed to the people of Colossus, which is a city in Greece. Well, what if you lived in Rome or in Greece? Yeah. Now, remember, if you were going to keep the holy days, there were animal sacrifices associated with all of them. And there was only one place that they could be made, and that was the temple in Jerusalem. So that meant if you wanted to keep the holy days, you had to go to Jerusalem. These people were not going to Jerusalem to do that. They weren't making the sacrifices. They weren't building a booth out of leaves and branches. But there were Jews that were showing up and saying, you're not keeping these days right. You're not building a booth out of leaves and branches. You're not making the sacrifices. You're not traveling to Jerusalem. That's what Paul was talking about. He's saying you don't have to do that, because we're under the spirit, not the letter. All right? Now, that's one of the keys you have to keep in mind if you want to rightly divide the word of truth. You okay then?
Yeah.
All right.
Meditating on what you're saying.
Okay.
About it.
All right. Now, another thing I want to talk about is the sacrificial system, which we don't keep. Now, let's look at Hebrews 9. All right. Well, in Hebrews 8, now, in Hebrews 8, Paul writes about the Levitical priesthood, which we are no longer under now. If you ask somebody, why don't you make animal sacrifices? The standard answer is because there's no more temple. That is not the reason that Paul gave in the book of Hebrews, because like I said, I think this was written before the temple was destroyed, but even if it was written afterwards, that's not the reason that it gives. The reason why we are not obligated to the sacrificial system is because it was purely symbolic. It was fulfilled by Christ, and the sacrifices did not atone for sin. Now I'm going to pick up the story in Hebrews 9, verse 9. It was symbolic for the present time, which both gifts and sacrifices are offered, which cannot make him who performed the service perfect in regard to conscience. Concerned only with foods and drinks, various washings, and fleshly ordinances imposed until the time of Reformation. So there's the word until, once again.
Well, you skipped over 8:5, who serve a copy and shadow of the heavenly things. I mean, it completely underscores and supports what your premise is.
Glad you brought that up. Good point. All right, these are a shadow of things to come. Now, here's the thing where people can sometimes get confused because, like I said, Christ fulfilled the law. That doesn't mean we don't have any obligations. But when you rightly divide the word of truth, you have to look at the purpose of these laws. And some of these things are purely symbolic. And once they've been fulfilled, and we're really not obligated to them unless you really think that you are. And the sacrificial system was the main one. There's 102 laws in the Torah concerning sacrifices. That's a lot. And then there's many others concerning the temple and the priesthood. That accounts for a lot of the law. But just remember that Israel was a physical nation with borders and a capital and a temple and a priesthood and a government. That nation is gone, even though, in a way they've been restored, but the church is not a nation. It does not have borders. It does not have a temple. And it does not have a government, in spite of what they told us in worldwide. Because there's nothing in the Bible about God's government or church government. What?
The church does have a temple. The church is the temple.
Exactly.
Well, okay. But it's not the same as what Israel had.
Well, they went to the temple to do their thing.
Yeah.
You are the temple, so God reigns within you. So there's a parallel there.
And our prayers are the sacrifices that go up to God as a pleasing scent.
Right.
So you have the physical temple of stone, the modern temple of flesh, the physical sacrifices versus the spiritual sacrifices. It's all flows what you're saying.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we're not discounting what you're saying. We're trying to help say, hey, this supports what you're saying, that there's the spiritual aspect that many people gloss over. You're right. Is the method of physical sacrifices needed anymore? Probably not. Will there be sacrifices in the kingdom? Maybe sacrifices of thankfulness, but for sin and et cetera, who knows? But right now, we're the temple. Our prayers are the sacrifices.
I don't have to take this. No, that's a good point.
You're awesome, man. Thanks.
All right. Now, I think we're on the same page so far. All right, now I'm going to pick up a story in Hebrews 9, starting at verse 11. But Christ came as a high priest of the good things to come with a greater and more perfect tabernacle, not made with hands, that is, not of this creation, Not with the blood of goats and calves, but with his own blood he entered the most holy place once and for all, having obtained eternal redemption. For if the blood of bulls and goats and the ashes of the heifer, sprinkling the unclean, sanctifies for the purifying of the flesh, how much more shall the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without spot to God, to purge your conscience from dead works, to serve the living God. And for this reason he is the mediator of the new covenant, by means of death, for the redemption of the transgressions under the first covenant, that those who are called may receive the promise of eternal inheritance. Now, this pretty much explains why we're not obligated to that sacrificial system. And it's not because there's no more temple and no more priesthood. It's because Christ fulfilled it. All right. Now, I want to move on to circumcision. How about that one?
Cutting
All right.
subject.
There's a fun one. Yes.
Ew.
All right. Okay, let's look at.
Mark,
Yeah.
this is a very painful topic. It hurts me just to talk about it.
I'm not in touch with that.
Oh, wait a minute. What was it?
No, I don't think so.
Okay, 225. Romans 225. I think that's what I want. All right, here we go. For circumcision is indeed profitable if you keep the law, but if you are a breaker of the law, your circumcision has become uncircumcision. Therefore, if an uncircumcised man keeps the righteous requirements of the law, will not his uncircumcision be counted as circumcision? And will not the physically uncircumcised, if he fulfills the law, judge you, who even with your written code and circumcision, are a transgressor of the law? For he is not a Jew who is one outwardly, nor is that circumcision which is outward in the flesh, but he who is a Jew is one inwardly, and circumcision is of the heart, in the spirit, and not in the letter, whose praise is not from men, but from God. Now, circumcision does have physical benefits, and if I had a son, I would certainly want him to be circumcised, but it's a physical thing. And what Paul is saying, circumcision doesn't make you righteous, and uncircumcision doesn't make you unrighteous. That's very clear right here. So, there were people that were trying to say to the Gentile Christians, you've got to be circumcised. Paul was saying, no. You don't have to do that because it's a physical thing. It's not a spiritual thing. Yes, it has physical benefits, but it doesn't change the relationship with God. So now there's another aspect of the law that has been changed. And I think we all understand that here. And now I wanted to look at where.
Well, you can even transcribe this to the concept of zizits. Is that how you say the word? Because that was supposed to be a reminder, right? But
Right.
if the law is written on your heart, do you need the reminder?
I agree.
And there are those who say it's because it's a edict for generations. I can't argue with that if that's what you feel. For him who thinks this is the right thing to do, so be it. I'm not going to argue because frankly, it's a waste of time. But what you're saying as far as circumcision goes, you're right. There are physical aspects that have benefit, but to say that physical action is a salvational issue and that's all you have to do is completely wrong. You go back to though I speak with the tongues of angels and have not love. So there's this dual component that, sure, circumcision's a great idea, but unless you're doing it for the right reason, it has no benefit. It doesn't mean anything. But at the same time, if you're at that state in your life where your heart is in it and you're really and truly trying to follow the law and and keep the testimony of God, of Yeshua, you can't argue with that. I mean, I think what I've been hearing, and correct me if I'm wrong, Mark, what you're trying to say is, it's like this love and faith and belief to some extent can trump the physical aspects. But if all you're doing is the physical aspects just to do it, I mean, if you're doing it because you think that in some capacity that's your path, quote unquote, to salvation, you're missing out on the entire. You're missing out on the whole thing. It's kind of like what was it James was saying? It's a dual thing. I keep the law as a sign of my faith, and I have faith because I see that the law points me in the direction I need to go.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, well, one of the points that I wanted to make tonight is that God gave Israel a lot of physical things to do, help them understand spiritual principles, but he did not pour out his spirit on these people. He gave his spirit to some of them because they had important jobs to do that they couldn't do without the spirit. But he's poured out his spirit onto the church, and he expects more from us. And he was tough on the Israelites, but he expects more from us than he did from them. And one of the reasons why we're under the spirit of the law rather than the letter of the law is because we have the spirit. Now, he gave them, like I said, all these physical things to do that had spiritual meaning, but they didn't even understand the meaning of the sacrifices. They thought these sacrifices atoned for sin.
Well, and they couldn't understand it. I mean, they'd been slaves for how many years? I mean, some say it was really like 100 and something odd years.
Well, it was over 400.
Well, that they were actually in the land of Egypt. That whole what was that movie, buddy? The Exodus movie. It goes through the whole time period. Patterns of evidence that they really truly didn't become slaves until probably about 100 or so years up to the end, because like communism, you start with one fence and then the next fence and then the third fence, and finally you've got the last one with a gate, and they keep coming in. We're talking about the analogy of pigs, and you keep feeding them, and then finally you close the gate and they're slaves. That's how the Israelites kind of were set up. They had famine, so on and so forth, and they were kind of set up for ultimately getting into the slave mentality. And so when you're really into that physical aspect of, I get up in the morning, I got to put food in my belly, it's all physical. God really had his work cut out for him. You're talking about 613 different precepts, if you will. I mean, there's really only 10 laws. But because they didn't have the capacity to spiritualize or put in their hearts the concept of these 10 commandments, they had to have additional interpretations in order to deal with each other.
Yeah.
And I'm not trying to hijack the conversation at all, because Paul and I have done many presentations on this idea, but they couldn't get beyond that stuff. They were still slaves, and hence why they had to go 40 years through the desert to finally get that generation to die, if you will, so that the next generation would be open to the idea of, hey, I have personal responsibility. I have the ability to think for myself, rational thought, etc., accept this deity as my one and only true God. But anyway, sorry.
Mark, would you give me commentary on Ezekiel chapter 44, verse 7, in light of the
Bring it
topic
on.
of this discussion?
Go ahead.
Oh, you'd like me to read it instead of you reading it?
He's asking you for your comments on what your thoughts are on that verse.
Well, I can't remember what's in there. Why don't you just read it? Yeah.
Okay. No, I just was wondering if that's what I should do. I'll read from the New King James, I suppose that's a common one, but well, just a little background. Ezekiel chapter 40 through 48 are talking about after they are brought back to the land after the Great Tribulation, etc. And they're now in Jerusalem, and there's a new temple. And so Ezekiel 44 is right in the middle and getting to the subject of the temple service. And so Ezekiel, I should go back to 46 just to get the, the full thought. Okay. Now say to the rebellious, to the house of Israel, thus says the Lord God, O house of Israel, let us have no more of all of your abominations. So, this must be fresh out, out of the tribulation. Excuse me. Verse 7. When you brought in foreigners, uncircumcised in the heart and uncircumcised in the flesh, to be in my sanctuary, to defile it, my house, and when you offered my food, the fat of the blood, or the fat and the blood, then they broke my covenant because of all your abominations. So this is speaking to people that have been given, they've been brought back to the land, they've been given the Holy Spirit, they're on the subject of who can go into the new temple, the millennial temple. And it says in verse 8, and you have not kept charge of my holy things, but you have set others to keep charge of my sanctuary for you. The Lord Yahweh says this, no alien uncircumcised in heart and body may enter into my sanctuary. None of the aliens living among the Israelites. Verse 10 next. And the Levites who went far from me, when Israel went astray, who strayed away from me after their idols, they shall bear their iniquity. Yet they shall be ministers in my sanctuary as gatekeepers of the house and ministers of the house. They shall slay the burnt offering and the sacrifice for the people. They shall stand before them to minister before them. Verse 12, because they ministered to them before their idols and caused the house of Israel to fall into iniquity, therefore I have raised my hand in an oath against them. Thus, says the Lord God, they shall bear their iniquity. Verse 13, and they shall not come near to me to minister to me as priests, nor come near any of my holy things into the holy place, but they shall bear their shame and the abominations which they have committed. Nevertheless, I will make them keep charge of the temple for all its work and for all that has to be done in it. As regards the Levitical priests, the sons of Zadok, who maintain the service of my sanctuary when the Israelites strayed far from me, they will approach me to serve me. They will stand in the presence to offer me the fat and the blood, declares the Lord Yahweh. Well, it goes on and on with all different things about the new temple, but I think you know what I'm talking about now.
Well, I had that question a long time ago, back in the mid-'80s. I remember asking the late John Pittman about that. And I never quite got that, because what Paul is saying in Hebrews 9 and 10 is pretty clear. And that we're not obligated to that system. And I couldn't figure out why that system would be restored. But if somebody is a spirit being, you're not going to be, there won't be any offerings for sin. And I never understood that. I really never did.
And maybe it's just like a I don't know, a physical example. As you're reading through this, and thanks for bringing this up, Mike. And it looks to me like it's merciful. It's saying, well, you've done some horrible things, but yet I'm still making you priests. I'm still allowing you to serve me, the Most High, performers of the duty of the house. And wow, I mean, I've had arguments with those who are so merciless, if you will, who are just like, hey, the United States is going to be taken over by, Europe, and we're all going to be put into slavery and so on and so forth, and God's not going to have any mercy. But you read stuff like this, and it's just like, there's some wiggle room in there. That's what I'm reading. What about you guys?
Well, there's a lot of this is Don, by the way, for those people.
Figured it out, yeah.
Yeah, I'm sitting off to the side here in mission control. Mike Waters and I, and several years ago, went through Ezekiel, the new temple, and it is different. The services are different. God tweaked the system to be where his glory could be there with them. They could see his glory at any time. There was no veil, and it's a teaching tool. It's also fulfillment. He said, I shall make David their king. I shall bring them back to the land. I shall restore these things unto my people. I mean, the Jews look forward to that. This is their goal. This is their pinnacle, if you will. So it's being fulfilled. He's fulfilling his promise to them. And the new temple and the new system is actually a teaching tool to these people.
Exactly. And I think that's kind of the thing I was wrestling with. Maybe in some respects you still have to have the physical, I guess, he does say he's going to keep the ruins of whatever happens through the tribulation as a teaching tool, I would imagine. Right? And I'm sorry I don't remember exactly where that is, but the destroyed cities or whatever. The idea being that when you're resurrected, you can't say, oh, well, this is heaven. You can point to, well, this is Phoenix, and it was destroyed during the tribulation. So yes, you're still on earth. So maybe there has to be some aspect of the temple system to help people. I don't know.
I think sometimes we're going to have to do a presentation on the temple, the new temple. It is really cool the way it's laid out, and it's really cool how it's set up. The new temple is set up so that you can get people through it quickly, and the sacrifices, the meat of the sacrifice is actually given to the people as they come. It's kind of like you came, you pay your respects, you bow down and worship, you pick up, you go to the food court, you get some food, and you leave.
Right, you get your barbecue, because God loves a good barbecue, right?
Well, yeah, it's really cool the way it's set up. And way God laid it out, you could put thousands of people through there in an hour. It's made so people can come and worship uninhibited. It's really neat the way it's set up.
Also, and as far as the next temple goes, Ezekiel 11 and
11 what, buddy?
7, it clearly shows that the next temple is going to be on the Mount of Olives. It won't be on Mount Moriah. But that's another story. I wanted to go back to the subject of circumcision. Now, circumcision did have a symbolic aspect to it, which was fulfilled by Christ. Does anybody know how it was fulfilled? What was the symbolic aspect to circumcision? Anybody?
You want to volunteer that, buddy?
You know this one.
Oh.
All right, well, the answer is in Mark 15, 38. Now, as you know, when Christ died on the cross, the veil in the temple was cut in half. The veil that separated the Holy of Holies from the rest of the temple was cut in half. That was a fulfillment of the symbolic meaning of circumcision, because it separated. It was great. Christ was separating, it's breaking down a barrier between us and God, between us and the Father. Now, I don't want to go over the details of the male anatomy, but in a way, I mean, you're separating a barrier, the most sensitive part of the male body. Let's just put it that way. But that was a fulfillment. I think the fulfillment of the symbolic meaning of circumcision. It's not the entire purpose of circumcision, but that was, I think, a fulfillment of that meaning. So I thought I'd mention that one. And now at this point, I think it'd be fun to do a brief overview of the law. Now, I'm not going to go over all of these, but I want to just try to break these into categories. Now, I have a list here. Now, supposedly there's 613 laws, statutes, and ordinances in the Bible. Now, that's the way it was broken down by a rabbi named Rambam a long time ago. That was his name, Rambam. I don't know when he lived, but the way this is enumerated, I don't really agree with this. Some of these are actually one law that are broken into two or more. Like, for instance, on the holy days, it'll say, do no work and rest. Well, it's the same thing. They're broken into two, for instance. Then there's other things in here that are not even laws. Then there's other things in here that he claims are in the Bible that are not even in the Bible. Then he keeps referencing the Talmud, which kind of irritates me.
Mm-hmm.
But I want to just go over some of these.
I was going to say the 600 and whatever mitzvot, wasn't like 400 of it for just the priesthood and the Jews? And
right. Well, that's what I'm saying. Well, it wasn't quite 400, but this is broken down, this list. Now, Tom Eldridge came in his list back in May of 2011. And
we'll say it's about 30 pages.
It's a lot of pages, but the thing is, this is broken down into topical categories. Now, the Bible doesn't specifically do that. And it doesn't specifically say 613. The number 613 is a man-made enumeration, and it's really not that many.
Well, they're pretty straightforward. I mean, they're broken down into, like, God, the poor, the priesthood, prayer and blessing. I mean, there's things. When Paul and I presented on this, I mean, you've got the thing in Luke 10 where it talks about, or Luke 10:27-ish. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and all your strength, etc., etc., and then love your neighbors yourself. So that encapsulates the first 4 of the 10, if you will, the Decalogue, and the last 6. So when we've done our presentation, again, not hijacking yours, the 613 are like precepts. So like Smith versus Jones, so how do you treat, a Gentile? How do you love the stranger in Deuteronomy or whatever it might be? Or if you got an ox that has a tendency to break its pen and it gets out and kills somebody, what do? Because there's nothing in the 10 that covers that. And because Israel was so physical and they didn't have the spirit to figure out how to apply the 10 to the situation, you had these 613 other things, or even more, because there's shalls and shall nots, statutes, whatever you want to call them, to kind of help them figure it out, because they didn't have the capacity to do it. They didn't have the spirit to do it.
Right.
And
these things, a lot of these things, like I said, they're physical. We're physical people of a physical nation that did not have the spirit. And that's one of the things you got to remember. But now I want to just go over some of these for various reasons. And I'm not trying to make fun of these things by any means, but some of these things in here, like I said, I don't even think they're actually laws. Like one of them is be fruitful and multiply. Now, is it a sin not to have children? No. The most productive servants that God has ever had didn't have any kids. So you can go back to Elijah and Elisha. Then you got Jeremiah and Daniel and John the Baptist and Paul and Christ himself. They didn't have any kids. No, I mean, when it says be fruitful and multiply, that was to Adam and Eve. That was a specific thing that he told them.
Well, and our situation, Mark. So in defense of that statement, that's the overall intent. But if God has another purpose for you, then that's your purpose. Because even the Apostle Paul says, he talks about marriage and how that'll, it's good or bad or whatever. So be it. Right? So
Right.
even though that's God's intent to be fruitful and multiply, if that's not what works out for you, then he's got another purpose for you.
I agree. All right, now I want to read another one here. Mitzvah number 14, do not add to the commandments of the Torah. Supposedly that's in Deuteronomy 13, verse 1. Actually, that's not what it says. That's actually in Revelation 21, which the Jews don't believe. But here's another thing. I was watching a couple of years ago, there was a YouTube video by a rabbi, and it was called The Jewish Critique of the New Testament, and he was making fun. He was saying, well, it never says at the end of the Old Testament, this to be continued. And he was saying that, well, the Christians have no right to add to add to the Hebrew Bible. And he was comparing the New Testament to the Book of Mormon. Oh, those crazy Mormons, who do they think they are? Right? Well, the Jews did the same kind of thing with the Talmud. Well, okay. They think that's inspired too. Well, I thought that was being very hypocritical. No, okay, and then like it says, okay, and on this list it says Deuteronomy 13:1, not to add to the commandments of the Torah. It doesn't actually say that. And then there's other ones in here where he's just misquoting.
Well, and not that I'm defending him by any means. I mean, that one actually talks about, if I recall correctly, about a prophet who foretells dreams and they don't come true kind of thing.
Yeah.
And can you stretch that to be who adds or deletes? Maybe, to some extent. But, I'm not trying to hijack. There's some iffy ones in here. I agree with you. It's kind of a stretch on some of these things, these mitzvos or whatever we're calling precepts, statutes, or whatnot.
Right. And then, and then, of course, there's laws, statutes, and ordinances. There's the word statute is used 70 times in the Torah. The word ordinance is used 19 times, and I'm not going to try to break those down. But they're not exactly the same. But now I want to go to, I'm moving through this. Deuteronomy 6, verse 8. To bind the law on the head and bind the law on the arm. All right. Now what it says is, the law will be a mark on your hand and a mark on your forehead.
That's good.
Right now, so what the Jews, you know how the Jews interpret that? They have a little black box that they strap to their head, and it contains a little copy of the Torah on it. They strap it to their head, and then they do a prearranged prayer. Then they strap it to the wrist, and they do another prearranged prayer. And I've seen this happen in 1991 at the airport in Paris, France. And at first, I didn't realize what was happening. But then when I was watching this, then I realized this is what this is talking about. But the thing is, when it says the law will be a mark on your hand and on your forehead, it's not talking about strapping a copy of the Torah to your forehead. It means, well, first of all, your hand symbolizes your actions, your forehead symbolizes your thoughts. The law is supposed to be manifested in your thoughts and your actions, but the Jews don't get that. They don't have the spirit, their physical mind, and they think that means you're supposed to literally strap it to your head. It's kind of silly, in my opinion. But that's in Deuteronomy 6, verse 8. All right, now let me move on here.
Well, that's no different than having it on your doorpost.
Right, that's another thing that it says you're supposed to put it on your doorpost, which you can do. Okay, that's fine.
And we've got that, yay us, but, it's a physical manifestation of something that should really be in the heart.
Right.
What verse is that other verse? That was
Deuteronomy 6, verse 8.
okay, not Deuteronomy 12:32.
Well, 6:9, Deuteronomy 6:9 is about the doorpost, having it written on your doorpost of your house.
Oh, okay. No, I'm behind here.
No worries.
All right, now that, like I said, this is broken down into categories: marriage, divorce, and family. That makes up 22 laws. And there's one of them in here that kind of jumped out at me. The bridegroom shall be exempt for a whole year from taking part in any public labor, such as military service, guarding the wall, or similar duties. Now, I don't think that means he doesn't have to do any work.
Are you talking about Deuteronomy 24:5, the whole...
Right, yeah.
Okay. Free for 1 year kind of thing?
Right, that was kind of cool. I kind of like that one, but I don't know if we don't really have to spend much time on that one. All right, then you've got forbidden sexual relations. They're very basic. We don't have to go over that. And that makes up about 25 laws for that. Then there's times and seasons. Here's another thing. This makes up a lot of them. Makes up about 40. Let's see. 106 to 42. This makes up about 36 laws. Now listen to this. The new month shall be solemnly proclaimed as holy, and the months and years shall be calculated by the Supreme Court only. Exodus 12:2. Well, okay, I looked up Exodus 12. There's no mention of a Supreme Court. There's no mention of the new month. I don't know how they came up with this. That's not what it says. Exodus 12:2. It says, the new month shall be solemnly proclaimed as holy, and the months and the years shall be calculated by the Supreme Court only. Doesn't say that. That's not what I saw in there.
Yeah, I've got that in my little study guide, and I kind of crossed that out.
All right, now the next one is not to travel on the Sabbath outside the limits of one's place of residence, Exodus 16:29. It actually does say that.
Exodus 16:29.
Now, this one's a little confusing to me because, as we all know, Christ and the disciples were out and about on the Sabbath on a regular basis. And in Mark 6, Christ was teaching in the synagogue on the Sabbath in Nazareth. They tried to kill him, but he was not in his home, his place of residence. I don't know where that was, but he was healing on the Sabbath. He was out and about on the Sabbath. He was in the synagogue on the Sabbath. It doesn't say that. I mean, it does say in Exodus 16:29, you've got to stay in your place of residence on the Sabbath.
You're right. I mean, it totally says that. And so, the whole rabbis who say you can't do more than a Sabbath day journey to go to the synagogue. No, wait a minute. you're supposed to, everyone stay in his place. That's what it says, right? Mike, you're online. Hebrew, Aramaic, everyone stay in his place.
No, it doesn't mean your tent. It's the way it is, commonly, the word is commonly used, was applied to the ghettos. The first ghettos were Jewish. No, it wasn't. They weren't the blacks. It was the Jewish people, which goes back, to the diaspora time. So how the Jewish people applied it is they all, say on a block, they all bought their homes on one block. And so that was their place. Their ghetto was their place.
Okay, so that's the later interpretation, but we're talking Exodus 16:29, time of Moses.
They didn't all sit in their tents all day.
Right.
It was like the best way to translate it is their common area. So in other words, zipping all over everywhere isn't really resting, especially if you're walking, from Jericho up to Nazareth. You could theoretically do that in a day, but those are two different dwelling places. But if you're in Nazareth, well, there's no problem, zipping around town and talking to people, going to the park or the common area, which is the example that Jesus set, was that he didn't head out on a long journey on the Sabbath, but he did hang around town, went to the city center.
I was talking about.
Yeah, so this would be a good study. I'm just throwing it out there.
Yeah.
In terms of reconciling Exodus 16:29 with, don't forsake the assembly.
Yeah. Yeah. So, in their nation, they all lived nearby. So how they would, kept the Sabbath in the ancient times was they were in their, their village or whatever. And they didn't sit in their tent and not come out of their tent all day. They stayed in their village, and that's how they got the idea of the Sabbath day journey while they were trying to figure out, well, they didn't have metropolitan areas. But so say if you live in the metropolitan area of Chicago, well, how do you define the Sabbath day journey compared to if you're in Helensville, Wisconsin? Two different concepts of your place, and so then they tried to break it down to, well, making a judgment out of it. Let's judge that so many steps are a Sabbath day journey, which they made a judgment, mishpat. So, but the spiritual application would be, kind of hang out where you are and rest.
The interpretation that I had gotten long, many moons ago was your community. Back then, everything was by family group.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, you didn't have an entire family in one tent, and you had families living together. So basically, it was, this isn't a day to pick up and be moving stuff around and doing all this other stuff. You just kind of hang out with your family and the family next door. It didn't permit, it didn't mean your dwelling. It meant your community group. At least that's what the interpretation I got a long time ago. I don't remember how, but the way the word is used in the Hebrew at that point, it means community group.
Sounds like
stay with you don't go on a 400-mile journey to go to a basketball tournament. Oh, I'm sorry.
Well, it sounds like it's something worth, further study. Again, Mark's kind of doing a 30,000 or 15,000 foot level overview, but
satellite image,
Yeah, satellite image. So,
here. No, I mean, I'm just picking and choosing some of these interesting things here. Most
Yeah,
of
no,
the
this is good. Totally good, man.
but I'm just looking at some of the stuff that kind of jumped out at me that I think we can talk about. Now, the next category that's on this list is the dietary laws. There's 26 of them, which we already do. They're pretty basic. I'm not going to read over those. Then we got business practices. And one of them on here, not to borrow at interest. You're not supposed to lend at interest. And you're not supposed to borrow at interest either. Well, that's something that we don't have a lot of control over. Good luck trying to buy a home or a car at no interest. Good luck. But like, you know, a lot of these things, here's another thing, is like I said, Israel was a nation with a government and with borders. And we don't live in a nation, we don't live in a Christian nation. We're sojourners. We're just passing through. And a lot of these things are civil laws that we don't have any control over. I wish we did, but you can't control the monetary system. You're not going to be able to keep the Jubilee year by yourself, unfortunately. Now, let me move on here. Oh, here's a good one. Number 199, to keep a Canaanite slave forever, Leviticus 25:46. Yeah, we're not legally allowed to have slaves in our society for some reason. I don't know why. Oh, and then you can't have bond servants either. That's another thing. But people know about bond servants, but yeah, they had slavery in ancient Israel.
Wait.
If somebody was a Gentile, you could enslave them for life.
Technically, a bondservant is an employee, isn't it?
Yeah.
Hey, Mark, I was going to run an ad on Craigslist to see if I could hire a slave.
Oh, boy. I don't know. You might get in trouble for that one.
Oh, it's
I
easy.
just want to find out, because if somebody is willing to be one, if someone said, hey, I'm doing this of my own free will so that I work off my debt.
Okay,
I mean,
so then you got to pierce their ear too, man.
Well, I don't love them that much.
Alan, the modern word is called intern.
That's it.
That's
Always did. If you want modern slaves, just make yourself into a bank.
Yeah.
You have lots of them.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
all right, now there's 19 laws concerning employees, servants, and slaves. 7 laws concerning vows, oaths, and swearing. I'm not going to go over those. Then you got your sabbatical years and jubilee years. There's 17 of those. Then you got court and judicial procedure. There's 36 of them, and like I said, these are civil laws that we don't have control over. Now, these are pretty basic. They're pretty straightforward. I don't think there's anything really alarming in there.
The judicial ones that say you shall not have a lawyer present in court.
No, I don't. There's nothing about lawyers in there. I mean, it's all really straightforward, basic stuff. And now I want to go to.
Well, and you know, to be fair, slaves were to be treated a specific way. They were still treated like human beings. You know, and that's kind of the difference. It's completely ironic that. Yeah, I probably shouldn't open the political wound. We have slaves across the ocean, if you will, that are completely dehumanized. And I'm not saying that slavery in this country was a walk in the park, but you know, you had slave owners that were white, you had slave owners that were black, you had slave owners that treated their slaves like human beings, and you had those who treated them completely like chattel. But if you really and truly were a Christian, you would look at these precepts and go, oh, well, I'm supposed to pay the wages to the hired man at the due time. You know, it's one of the things that Paul and I try to do as soon as my guy sends me an invoice, I try to pay it that day. You know, because that's what the Bible says to do. I have a client that's 6 months behind in paying my invoice. Is that right? No. But I'm the better person because I pay my people anyway, even if I don't have the money from the client, because that's what God says to do. That's the hired laborer. You know, the same thing with the slaves. You know, if someone comes in and they don't have a or they have a family, they go out with the family. You know, God has a specific way of handling this stuff, and if we had honored it, would things be different? Of course. Would they be better? Of course. But you know, fallible human beings aren't going to understand these 16 or 613 precepts, Mark, that you're trying to, you know, chip through, if you will. But it is ultimately, you know, as spirit beings in the kingdom, I don't think we're going to have 613 precepts. It's going to be, you know, Mark, you're a spirit being. You know the law. It's written on your heart. You know, judge righteous judgment. It says in Isaiah, no longer will you not see your teachers. Walk ye, you know, here's the way, walk ye in it. That's going to be you, man, because you're going to know it. You know the law.
That's in Hebrews 8:11.
Well, it's also in Isaiah too.
The law because they already know it. That's what it's saying.
But I think in Isaiah too, you know, it says, no longer will you not see your teachers or something like that. I'm not going to argue because I'm tired and it's been a long week. I don't know. But anyway, no, this is good because these are like, these 613 things are like guidance.
Right. Now these are principles, and like I said, a lot of these are civil laws we don't have any control over. Some of these are things that we're not even legally allowed to do. And some of these things, well, a lot of these things concern the sacrificial system. There's 102 laws just about the sacrificial system. And there's a lot of them just concerning the Levites. A lot of them concern the temple. And now I want to keep going through this list. There's 4 laws concerning injuries and damages, which are like, you know, make a parapet for your roof. That's part of our building code. So nobody falls off your roof. Property rights, there's another 11 laws, so they're really basic. Then you've got the criminal laws, which are civil laws that we don't have any control over. There's 7 of them here listed. Then you've got punishment and restitution, which are also part of the criminal code, but this is something that I want to point out one of these. Leviticus 20, verse 14. Now, where are they? This is kind of interesting here. Look at this one.
Is that the burning with fire thing?
Right, yes, it is. Oh, boy. All right, now. If a man marries a woman and her mother, it is wickedness. They shall be burned with fire, both he and they, that there may be no wickedness among you. Ooh. Wow. That's pretty serious stuff. Now, there was another one, and they were like, and this is not on the list, but it's something that I remember Mike pointing out, and I remember reading this years ago, that, well, I'm getting to this, but if the daughter of a Levite plays the harlot, ooh, you burn her with fire. Now I'm getting to this. So we're not legally allowed to do that. But wow. You remember, I remember several years ago, there was a story out of Iran where a woman was stoned to death for adultery. Mm-hmm. What happened to the man? Well, who cares?
It happens all the time over there.
Well, yeah, I don't know. He got off with it. Well, they had a double standard, unfortunately, but that's another story. But the thing is,
this isn't.
All right, that's Iran. Now you could say, oh man, those crazy Muslims and their crazy Quran. I'm so glad there's nothing like that in the Bible, is there? All right, now let's look at Deuteronomy 22.
I'm thinking this is Jephthah's daughter. Guessing.
No, that's different. Deuteronomy 22, I'll pick it up.
Okay.
All right, I'll pick it up in verse 20.
Got it.
Man marries a woman. All right. Well, well,
2220?
yeah, well, okay. What they did was they'd have a piece of cloth on the bed, and if there was no blood on the cloth, well, then she was in trouble. Bring out the young woman to the door of her father's house, and the men of her city shall stone her to death with stones, because she has done this disgraceful thing in Israel, play the harlot in her father's house.
But none of the guys got,
No, yeah, that's another thing. So you shall put away this evil from among you. All right, well, she was not a virgin. You were supposed to stone her to death. I can't imagine doing that, and then you'd have to deal with the rest of the family, because I mean, these people would be your neighbors. So can you imagine going to a block party and going, "Hey, sorry about your daughter. Had to stone her to death. What a slut." Well, I mean, they did not have a police force in ancient Israel, nor did they have a prison system. But it's kind of like the Old West in the 1800s, where people they did not have access to a law enforcement, so they would take matters into their own hands, and they would act as judge, jury, and executioner, and they'd string people up and hang them. But I'm not sure that's the kind of world that I really want to live in. But that's what it says, and you can laugh at these crazy Muslims and their crazy Quran, but the Bible actually says the same thing. All right. And then
Well, there's a companion to that one. But you know what? We'll save that for another study.
Well, in Deuteronomy 22, verse 22, it says if a man and a woman are committing adultery, both the man and the woman must die, because you must purge the evil from Israel. So it's not like Iran.
Well, and okay, let's pick that scab.
Well, they were supposed to stone the man to death too.
Well, right.
Yeah.
2225, she's betrothed, and he rapes her, forces her. Yeah, the guy gets killed, right? Because I've had enough of people saying, well, the Bible says you need to marry your rapist, sort of stuff. Homosexual friends throw in my face. I'm like, no, that's not what it says.
This can go a long way in the wrong direction. Can we move on? Because every time we go down this rabbit trail, it goes on forever.
Which is exactly why I'm saying let's save this for another day.
All right, we're going to move on.
Yes, the moderator says move on.
All right. Now here's another one that I think that's kind of intriguing to me. Do not remove. Well, now here's what it says in this list. Do not remove the entire beard like the idolaters. That's in Leviticus 19:27. Now, what it says, don't trim the corners of your beard. Now, people have interpreted this to mean that every man is supposed to grow a beard. Now, that's not what it specifically says. And I've seen rabbis that have a clean shave. They don't all grow beards. And I don't know why God would care whether or not you have a beard. Now, this one never quite made sense to me. I don't know. I mean, I'm not saying I never liked the pointy goatee myself, but I don't think this means that you have to grow a beard. It says don't shave the corners, according to the New King James.
Well, I think this is precept 300 and something odd other. The Muslims interpret this to not cut beards at all. Of course, they've basically borrowed a lot of stuff from Judaism and Christianity. But others have said, I think this was a worldwide thing. You're not supposed to cut, your facial hair into some sort of idolatrous form.
I think we'd have to know what the ancient pagans were doing
Well,
to really
right.
know what this
We don't
really
know.
means.
We have no idea what that even means. So
Yeah, I mean,
like,
really.
I don't have the context.
Right. That's another thing. I don't want to spend a lot of time on that one. That one's kind of different. Also, there's Leviticus 19:28. Not to have tattoos. And that's a big thing in our society nowadays. That's only been within the past 30 years, really. Up until 30 years ago, it was just prisoners and sailors that had tattoos. But the Bible says not to do that. People were doing that way back then.
Right.
Now I want to move on to, well, then you got a lot of these laws pertain to agriculture, and they really only pertain to farmers, and they don't specifically apply to us. Some of them pertain to, like don't reap the corners of your field because the poor people are going to be passing by. They're going to want to pluck heads of grain. That's fine. But the principle is be mindful of the poor. That's the idea. All right.
But that you Mark, you've hit the nail on the head, because that whole section, those precepts, it's basically saying, yeah, take care of the poor, and here's how you do it. Here are some suggestions or precepts or ordinances or whatever the heck you want to call them. Here's how you do it.
Right. Because we're under the Spirit rather than the letter. That's Romans 7, verse 6. Now we've got, it says not to mix wool and linen. That's another one. I never quite figured that one out.
Okay, James Rudd has something here. Please, Jim. Okay, one of the 613 precepts is you should not eat the Passover with anyone who is not circumcised, which I think we talked about earlier. Yet, Acts 15, Paul and Titus and Timothy, with Timothy being the one not circumcised. We covered this earlier too before you tuned in. Show you can have Passover with someone who is not circumcised. How does the 613 precepts deal with that? He covered this earlier, showing the differences between the two covenants and the Spirit and the letter of the law, and we were just going through the overview of the 613. So, anyways, basically,
James?
Jim Rudd, yeah.
Okay,
So, what is your answer? Sorry, I was late. Your answer of how the law could say the old covenant says you can't eat with someone who's circumcised. The new covenant says you can.
Right.
So can you go back through that and kind of mention what you said earlier?
I was talking about how circumcision it's symbolic and it's physical, and that's in that is in, where did I put those notes? That's in Romans. Where was it now? Romans
11:21.
2.
No.
Romans 2:25 through 29. That's where you want to look. I went over that. Now, there's another 30 laws concerning the Levites, and they were judged by a higher standard than the rest of us. But they are no longer our priesthood, because that's another one of the differences between the new covenant and the old covenant. And then Paul explains that in Hebrews 9, is that under the first covenant, Aaron was the high priest. Under the second covenant, Christ is our high priest. Christ has replaced Aaron as our high priest. That's another one of the one of the main differences between the two covenants. All right, now we've got tithes and taxes. That makes up another 24 laws. I'm not going to go over that one. Then we've got the temple. That makes up 33 more laws. I'm not going to go over that because we don't have that. Then we got sacrifices and offerings. That makes up over 100.
I think you missed like tithes and taxes, buddy. But
No, he passed over that.
It's
It's the new tax cut.
I mean, we don't have to mess with that. I mean, it's really, I mean, that, like I said, that was for a physical nation, which we're not part of.
Right.
And now we got, well, ritual purity and impurity. Now this is concerning. Now there's a lot of this stuff has to do with health laws and cleanliness, quarantine, and you got, there's over 30 laws that concern food, which we already keep. All right, so that's pretty basic. These are common sense things. Then there's 10 laws that concern the Nazarites, 7 laws concerning the king. The king shall not have an excessive number of wives. Deuteronomy 17:17. Hey, that's pretty funny, huh? Well, you know about Solomon. He had 300 wives and 700 concubines. But do you know how many wives David had? Take a guess.
20?
No, it was, we had,
9? I don't know.
no, it was, it's in Second Chronicles. I think he had 8 wives and 10 concubines.
Micah, Abigail, Bathsheba.
Listen at Second Chronicles. You know, I want to look at that. Let me see here. But yeah, I think he had 18 women, 18 or 19.
Slacker compared to his son, anyway.
But he had a lot of girl trouble, and they really, that's the kind of thing that can ruin a man. And look what happened to Solomon. He didn't know it, but he was ruining his life. I'm sure he thought he was doing just great, living it up, living like Hugh Hefner. Even Hefner never lived like Solomon, but no, that's the kind of thing that I mean, it turned his heart away from God, and it's really sad. It really is. I mean, it's not something we joked about, but all right now. Oh yeah, destroy the last one here. Destroy the seed of Amalek. Deuteronomy 25:19. That was a tough one for me because some of my best friends are Amalekites, and I hang out with these guys and we drink in the bar. So that's tough. But anyway, that's the end of it.
So who do you identify as an Amalekite?
Tough crowd, man. This is known as working the crowd. That was a joke.
No, I'm just asking.
I thought they were all gone. Maybe they're still hanging around in Palestine. I don't know.
I'm asking an innocent question. I don't know.
What do you consider? Yeah.
Well, I don't know. I don't know if they're still around. But yeah, they were told that the Israelites were told to kill those people. They did not do it.
Right.
So I think they're still around. They don't know who they are.
Oh yeah.
PLO. Oh.
Yeah, probably. They might be PLO. They might be Palestinians. I don't know. Maybe Mike would know.
Well, it's just a matter of logic. If it says that they would be continually at war with Israel, you just look at who's at war with Israel. And, you know, okay, you said the obvious, the Palestinians, but we know that the Palestinians were, you know, not a nation back, you know, years ago. So there was various Arab workers that the British brought in that just stayed there. You know, there were tribes people. So I think you'd have to actually look at the tribes, you know, and some of the tribes get along well with Israel, you know, like the Kenites, they're still there. And they always got, yeah, well, that would be the Saudis actually just north of Yemen, south of Mount Sinai. And so you know, it's a tribe by tribe thing, but there's been a lot of mixing. But, you know, if you want to, well, who's the number one enemy that's always trying to, you know, who's the latest Haman? And, you know, chances are that person would be an Amalekite, you know, like Hamas, you know, but, you know, because they're perpetually, they have no plan for peace with Israel. Their only outcome is for Israel to be totally destroyed and out of their land. is the way they look at it. If you look at any Palestinian map, there is no such thing as Israel. They totally do not accept that Israel is even a country at all. It's just a hostile occupation as far as they're concerned. And so that's just kind of the way I look at it, is who's perpetually at war with Israel. And that would be my best guess.
So you think the Amalekites are still living there, huh?
Well, it says right to the end, they'll be at war with them to the very end if they're not killed.
Mm-hmm.
And, and I kind of see both points of view. Say, what was it, on Monday, the Israel and Gaza were at, going into 100% full hot war. Well, then on Tuesday, they brokered a peace and, called they agreed on a ceasefire. Well, then the Israeli Avner Lieberman, the defense secretary, resigns because he wants to go in and totally wipe them out. And now a lot of Israelis are agreeing. I mean, we just got to just totally commit genocide on those people. Well, it goes way back, if King Saul would have done it, there wouldn't be a perpetual enemy of Israel now. And but now what do we do? Should they go and commit genocide against the quote unquote Amalekites now and just say wipe out Hamas? And especially, they did a lot of bombing with white phosphorus bombs in Gaza. So you definitely have two fighting factions within the Israeli government, and there's some that want to just totally commit genocide against the people in Gaza. So it's a tough deal now. I mean, because if they would go and do that, they'd be hypocrites, because we're all supposed to think that the genocide against the Jews was a bad thing, by Hitler. Well, wouldn't it be a bad thing to commit genocide against the Amalekites? And
this is where, you and I might disagree slightly. And the phrase is basically the day that those folks in the Gaza Strip actually care about their children is the day they'll stop launching rockets. I mean, they literally are, just shooting rockets. They know they're not necessarily going to land all of them because they've got the Iron Dome, but still, it's just really, when things were released, when the land was released and they gave the Gaza Strip back, it was given back with verdant fields, greenhouses, ways of self-supporting, and instead they chose to destroy it and take aid from the UN, from the United States, but the money never reached the people. It just went to the elites, the people who kept saying, hey, we're going to do stuff, but they never did stuff.
Well, according to a Palestinian guy, he told me that 1/3, on the average, 1/3 gets to the people, 1/3 to arms, and 1/3 to Swiss bank accounts of the leaders.
Well, we're basically saying the same thing.
Yep.
So, it's kind of to the point where I'm ready, because Yeshua's got to come down and basically sort this stuff out, because we're either not capable or we're not willing.
It does say in Obadiah, especially, and a few other places, Joel, I believe, that the number one task after Christ returns is genocide, to totally destroy every man of the Edomites. And so that's where I think if you look at who the Edomites are, you just look at who's at perpetual war with the Israelites. And how do they say that? You might be a redneck. You might be an Amalekite if you're perpetually at war with Israel.
Right. And one of the fascinating things. I mean, the folks that I've been kind of reading up on who do the deep dive. Maybe we should stop recording because Mark, I think are we done with Mark's conversation? Because I don't want to shift the topic.
Go ahead. I'm done.